And in the summer of 1836, a missionary by the name of Dr. Gregory, who was working for the Episcopal Missionary Society, stops in Milwaukee on his way to Green Bay because he has been assigned to work with the Oneida Indian community that was brought from New York State to Wisconsin in previous years. And at that point, he agrees to conduct an Episcopal service in Milwaukee for anybody who is willing to do that. The group met, the actual number I do not know because it's not recorded. However, the group then decided that they will continue to meet and try to develop a church as early as possible. And in May of 1838, St. Paul's American Protestant Episcopal Church is founded in Milwaukee. Early on, a missionary is sent from New York to be in essence, the rector of St. Paul's. However, he lasts 3 months, and the record indicates that this was just too primitive a community for him, and he returned to New York. Subsequently, they begin to meet at people's homes, and what they do is they read the Book of Common Prayer, and they also have a book of sermons that they read from. And the minutes of the church indicate that certain people were selected to read because they were, quote, very good readers, which may suggest that some of the people weren't very good readers. By 1839, Milwaukee's second rector, Lemuel Hall, arrives from Connecticut. He's an experienced rector. His wife and 2 children accompany him. And he begins the process of really developing St. Paul's as a worshiping community. By 1840, the church makes an agreement with the Milwaukee County government to rent the courthouse, the courtroom in the courthouse, as a place of worship. And from 1840 to 1845, every Sunday, the courtroom in the courthouse becomes an Episcopal worship space. They were able to rent it at $12.50 for 6 months. They had to do it 6 months at a time. In 1845, they built their first church. And a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Ackerly, who was in Cincinnati, took the position of rector here at St. Paul's in Milwaukee. So at this point, St. Paul's is the first Episcopal church in Milwaukee. It's really one of the first churches in the state of Wisconsin for the Episcopal Church. And it begins to develop, the population grows in Milwaukee, and things get bigger and bigger. Back in those days, once the church is established, every Sunday is morning prayer. Communion is held once a month, and the records indicate that they go through morning prayer first, and then they announce the communion will be available, and a significant number of the members of the church get up and leave, and other people stay for communion. In those days, one of the things that you did when you took communion is you offered a communion alms, and that became part of the rector's purse to be able to do good deeds in the city, meeting the needs of the congregation and the larger community. There was no restriction on how the money could be used. So it was the combination of communion alms and then donations by people in the congregation that allowed the rector to have that flexibility in terms of what he wanted to do. The rector was well paid in those days compared to a lot of other people. His annual income was $600 a year, and he had an allowance for a horse and a buggy. It became important for him to document how he was using those monies that were donated for the common good. Benjamin Ackerly maintained excellent records about his expenditures on behalf of the congregation to meet the common good needs, not only of the congregation, but of the community. So it gives you an idea of the different things that a rector was expected to do at that point. And we have 4 years worth of this, and it's a great documentation of what life was like back in the 1840s. Bought wagon maker tools for Reuben James. Reuben James was an individual who was a wagon maker, but his wife became ill. So he had to sell his tools to get enough money to survive. So once her medical condition was resolved, the church bought him tools so he could get back into his trade. He paid for 1/4 schooling of Margaret Parkinson. Again, he was paying for the tuition of a student to be able to go to school. Paid to the Irish Relief Fund. If you'll recall, at this period of time in history, the Irish famine was a major problem, and the church was raising money to send stuff off for that, and they raised a total of $9.30 to be sent to the Irish Relief Fund. He was also purchased a hearse and sleigh for the funeral of William, son of Benjamin Dannon. The Dannon family was a member of this congregation that had extreme problems, and the children were passing away, and he was providing the hearse and the sleigh for the funeral at that time. Bought a quart of brandy and 6 ounces of laudanum for Mrs. Dannon. This follows the catastrophes in the Dannon family, and she got brandy and laudanum. By the way, the laudanum was legal back in those days. I don't think they really had a good understanding of what it did, except that it seemed to calm people down. Communion offering for the survivors of the Phoenix. The Phoenix was a Great Lakes schooner that sank off of Port Washington. And there were a number of people died, but a number of people survived but lost all their things. And they raised $48.17 for that. Ackerly leaves Milwaukee in 1852, and the record indicates he's leaving for personal health reasons. Exactly why or wherefore, we do not know, but there seems to be no acrimony around it. He leaves, he goes to New York to recuperate. His father is a doctor, and so he goes back there to recuperate. And for a short period of time, St. Paul's is again without a rector, and they go back to reading the Book of Common Prayer and the Book of Sermons. But the congregation is continuing to grow, and they'll put an addition onto the church because they need more space. In 1854, a new rector comes. His name is James Cook Richmond, who will prove to be a controversial individual over time. At the same point in time of 1854, there is what's known in Milwaukee as the Joshua Glover affair. And Glover was an escaped slave from Missouri, and he had escaped to Racine, Wisconsin, and was employed in a sawmill from 1852 to 1854. His original slave owner discovered where he was in 1854 and asked the federal marshal in Milwaukee to arrest him and jail him pending his removal to Missouri. And then the marshals arrested him under the fugitive slave law and brought him to Milwaukee and jailed him in the Milwaukee County jailhouse. The original request to have Glover freed was made to the federal judge in Wisconsin, who is also a member of this church, and he denied the request to have Glover freed based on the existing law at the time, which was the federal law and also the Supreme Court Dred Scott decision. At that point, a man by the name of Sherman Booth, who is an editor of the Wisconsin Democrat and an ardent abolitionist, begins to circulate documents in Milwaukee asking all the free men of Milwaukee to free this slave from jail. And they get a couple of hundred men. They go up to the county jail, led by a man by the name of Rycraft, who's a friend of Booth's. They break into the jail. They free Glover. Glover is taken out to Waukesha to a point of getting into the Underground Railroad. He eventually leaves Wisconsin and ends up in Toronto, Canada. But the Glover affair doesn't end because Booth is charged by the federal government as participating in this riot to free Glover, and so he's got legal issues associated with it. Booth and Miller were both members of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and the removal of Glover from the jail was a violation of the law. Miller, being a federal judge, had to deal with a member of the congregation, and that created a certain amount of tension. Reverend Richmond, who's now the rector at St. Paul's, decides that this issue requires something from the pulpit, and he delivers a sermon which is somewhat castigating of the federal judge, Miller. And Judge Miller, in the middle of the sermon, gets up and leaves the church, and is reported by family members who are still members today that he said he's not coming back until this rector leaves. Richmond had a number of problems in terms of his relationship with the congregation. One of them was he would sing A Mighty Fortress in German, Ein feste Burg, and from the altar area. And this bothered many people in the congregation. If people arrived late for service, he would call them out. A series of things like that that led to problems. Eventually, the church locked him out. In other words, he wasn't able to get into the building, which then caused another level of consternation. The bishop had to intervene and indicate a rector had a right to get into his church. And this went on for a period of time. Finally, Richmond left and took a group of the parishioners with him to a mission in the 3rd Ward of Milwaukee. Eventually, that mission became known as Trinity Church, and Trinity Church ultimately became today what we know as All Saints Cathedral. And that takes a number of years for that to transpire.